Really wish I could read that.
Arrival is a movie about aliens arriving on Earth to make contact with humanity, but it's also a story about a linguist, tasked with deciphering their unusual language to discover why they've come, and whether their intentions are peaceful. The aliens, called heptapods, are nothing like us biologically. They walk on 7 limbs, they don't have a recognizable face, and they communicate by projecting circular glyphs from their tentacled hands. In the process of learning their language, the linguist, Louise, finds herself undergoing a strange transformation. The heptapod language fundamentally changes the way she thinks and the way she perceives reality. It changes her perception of time. She begins having flashbacks, memories of a life with a daughter she never knew she had. But we learn, as she does, that these aren't flashbacks. They're visions of the future. Learning this otherworldly language has given her an ability no other human has, to see time as a circle, without beginning or end. How plausible is this? Could learning an alien language really rewire your brain and radically change the way you think and see the world? Is there any scientific basis for this at all? Arrival really fascinates me because it tackles big questions about language, culture, and the mind. It explores the inherent difficulty of translation, the challenge of interacting with organisms that not only have a very different culture and language, but a fundamentally unrecognizable biology, and of course, the question that has cast a shadow over the field of linguistics for nearly 100 years, whether the language you speak can change the way you think. I'm Ryan, this is Language of Mind, and today I want to talk about the science of arrival. To create the alien language in the movie, the production team hired several linguists from McGill University in Montreal, including Jessica Kuhn, a specialist in linguistic typology and fieldwork. I think she was a perfect choice because the kind of work she does as a linguist is exactly the kind of work Louise does in the movie. This is one of the things Arrival gets exactly right. The way Louise interacts with the heptapods to understand their language is exactly how linguists research human languages in real life. But trying to decipher an alien language might pose unique challenges we don't face when documenting human languages.
Now you heard it. What do you make of it?
Human languages have an awful lot in common that we tend to take for granted. Every language has a way of asking questions, of making commands, of reporting what other people have said. And languages tend to encode the same kinds of information, things like number, person, and tense, most likely because these reflect universal human experiences and tap into innate cognitive abilities that all humans share. Check out my video on the evolutionary origins of grammar if you want to know more about this. I go into a lot of detail about the connection between human language and some cognitive abilities that go way, way back in our evolutionary history. It's not clear that an alien organism, one that evolved in a very different environment with a different biology, would have the same kinds of universal experiences and mental abilities that we do. Would an alien language even have nouns and verbs? Would there be a direct translation of something simple like a question or a command?
First, we need to make sure that they understand what a question is. Okay, the nature of a request for information along with a response.
Human languages share a lot of common structure too. They're built from the same parts and often assembled in very similar ways. Jessica Kuhn has noted striking similarities between the Mayan languages in Central America and the Austronesian languages of the Pacific. For example, in the Mayan language Kaqchikel, there's a special suffix added to transitive verbs that matches their subject. The same suffix is added to possessed nouns that matches their possessor. This might seem like an odd or random connection, but this exact pattern appears in Niuean, an Austronesian language in the Pacific. And it's not just these two languages. This same pattern appears in unrelated languages all over the world. According to Jessica Kuhn, languages may differ, but they follow similar recipes. And the shared structure in human languages goes even deeper. According to Noam Chomsky, all languages share a universal hierarchical structure, a tree-shaped scaffolding that organizes words and phrases. The only real difference between a language like English and a language like Japanese, other than sounding different, is that the branches of the tree are flipped one way in English and the other in Japanese. In fact, Chomsky has even imagined that if a Martian linguist were to come to Earth and study our languages, they might seem so similar that the Martian would think we all speak minor variations of the same language.
We have come to visit you in peace.
This is because all humans share an innate, universal grammar, a hardwired ability to learn languages that conform to a universal hierarchical structure. Language looks the way it does because our brains are uniquely equipped for a very specific kind of language. Of course, if we meet aliens, we won't be able to rely on this universal structure, which could make the process of deciphering an alien language difficult or even impossible. I really try to be an optimist, but without a shared history, culture, biology, or basic structural similarity, it's hard to predict what an alien language would even look like. The heptapods in Arrival actually have two separate languages. Heptapod A is a vocal communication system that sounds vaguely like whale song, while Heptapod B uses visual symbols, which is more like human writing. The scientists in Arrival decide to analyze heptapod speech first, and they do it in the same way that we analyze human speech and animal vocalizations in real life. The closest analog we have to deciphering an alien language on Earth is probably Project SETI, a long-running project to decode the vocal communication of sperm whales. Whales are some of the most intelligent animals on Earth. They communicate with elaborate songs and even have dialects. Whales will innovate new kinds of songs and share them with other whales, just like humans do. But so far we don't have a very good idea of what they're communicating. Project SETI focuses on recording interactions between mothers and calves in the wild, then analyzing these vocalizations using machine learning to understand their structure and decipher what the whales might be saying to one another. So far, the project has learned lots of interesting things about whale communication. For example, that sperm whale songs have sounds with very similar acoustic and structural properties as vowels in human languages. Whether they serve the same purpose remains to be seen. In Arrival, the scientists don't get very far analyzing heptapod A, so they pivot and study heptapod B. This is when their big breakthrough takes place, and it's where some of the most important scientific questions enter the picture. Heptapod B, the visual symbol language of Arrival, was designed not by a linguist, but by an artist, Martin Bertrand. It's not a full language like Klingon or Dothraki, but the production team did hire Stephen Wolfram and his son Christopher to turn Martin Bertrand's art into a set of about 100 unique heptapod B symbols. Each one is meant to represent something like a complete sentence. In the movie, heptapod B is described as semisiographic. It conveys meaning, but not sound. Written languages in the real world aren't languages in their own right. Human writing represents the sound and structure of a spoken language. Unlike human writing, heptapod B is a completely separate language from heptapod A. This doesn't happen often in the real world, but I know of at least one situation where a writing system might be considered a language of its own. It's not uncommon for deaf signers of languages like ASL to be fluent in written English without knowing any spoken English at all, even though English and ASL are completely different languages with almost nothing in common. In these cases, written English functions as a language in its own right. For deaf signers, it doesn't encode spoken English because they don't know what spoken English sounds like. Because heptapod A and B are entirely separate, this gives heptapods two communication channels they can deploy at the same time to convey two different messages. It's not clear whether this is a learnable skill for humans, though. There are a lot of bimodal bilinguals, people fluent in both a signed and spoken language, who can blend the two languages seamlessly, but I haven't yet come across a convincing account of bimodal bilinguals holding two different conversations at once. It's likely that we don't have enough attention and working memory for this to actually work. The most important feature of heptapod B, though, is its structure. Heptapod logograms are circular, and by the logic of the movie, constitute a kind of non-linear orthography. Heptapod symbols have no forward or backward direction, no beginning or end, and it's this property of the heptapod language that causes Louise's perception of time to dramatically change.
You know, I was doing some reading about this idea that if you immerse yourself into a foreign language, that you can actually rewire your brain.
The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
The idea that the language you speak affects the way you think has a long history, but it wasn't given serious treatment until it was developed by the linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf. Whorf was a field linguist, just like Jessica Kuhn. In the 1930s, while studying the Hopi language, he formulated a theory based on the way Hopi speakers seem to talk and think about the flow of time. He said, "I find it gratuitous to assume that a Hopi who knows only the Hopi language and the cultural ideas of his own society has the same notions of time and space that we have, and that are generally assumed to be universal. In particular, the Hopi has no general notion or intuition of time as a smooth flowing continuum in which everything in the universe proceeds at an equal rate, out of a future, through a present, into a past." In other words, the way we conceive of the world around us and everything in it is strongly influenced and may even be determined by the language we speak. This hypothesis, especially in its strongest form, is rejected by most modern linguists and was controversial from the start. And the idea of a timeless Hopi, a people with no conception of time, nowadays is treated as a myth. But it's such an intuitively appealing idea, which is probably why it's stuck around for almost 100 years. Linguistic determinism is almost certainly false. Your language doesn't limit what kinds of thoughts you can have. Linguists generally believe that all human languages are equally expressive. Any thought can be communicated in any language. Whorf himself said of the Hopi language, despite having no temporal markers, at the same time, the Hopi language is capable of accounting for and describing correctly all observable phenomena of the universe. There may be some truth to a weaker version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, though, a kind of linguistic relativity. Language doesn't determine how we think, but it might nudge us in certain directions. All languages have some way of expressing time, of locating events in the past, present, or future. But not all languages express this in the same way. Many languages refer to time using spatial metaphors. In English, we use a horizontal linear metaphor to describe time. Past events are behind us, future events in front of us. We move meetings forward, we push deadlines back. In Mandarin, the dominant spatial metaphor to talk about time is vertical. Earlier events are up, later events are down. The question is whether these spatial metaphors have a measurable effect on the way we think about time. Lera Boroditsky has probably done more research on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis than any other cognitive scientist. In a series of experiments, she showed that English and Mandarin speakers are sensitive to spatial relationships that match the dominant metaphor for time in their native language. Participants in these experiments would see an image of two objects either side by side or one on top of the other. Then they would answer a time-related question like, does March come before April? English speakers were faster to answer these time questions after they saw a horizontal image, and Mandarin speakers were faster after they saw a vertical image. That's because we tap into the same mental resources when we think about spatial relationships and temporal relationships, because of the unique spatial metaphors we use to describe time. Boroditsky also tested bilinguals who were familiar with both kinds of spatial metaphors and found a relationship between how early they learned English and their spatial priming. Early English learners had more horizontal priming. Later English learners had more Chinese-like vertical priming. In one more experiment, she had English speakers learn a new vertical time metaphor. They would read things like, Monday is above Tuesday. After a small amount of training, English speakers suddenly started showing results that looked a lot more like Mandarin speakers. These spatial metaphors have real power over how our mind organizes concepts related to time. Vertical or horizontal expressions of temporal relations train the brain to encode time the same way we encode relationships in space. And you can easily retrain the way your brain encodes time just by learning a new metaphor. So in a small way, learning a new language could reshape how we think about time. In Arrival, it's not their spoken language that changes Louise's perception of time, it's their written language. Heptapod B is non-linear. It has no forward or backward direction, no beginning or end. This is the property that dramatically changes the way Louise thinks and gives her the ability to look into the future. Of course, this is far-fetched, but it's worth investigating whether the structure of writing might have an effect on how we perceive time in the real world. Something I noticed rewatching this movie recently is how often characters, especially Louise, move across the screen from left to right. This almost definitely is not a coincidence. Most filmmakers are highly aware that left-to-right movement is associated with positive feelings like character growth, progression, or even movement toward the future. Right-to-left movement tends to be perceived as much more negative and less active. A fascinating 2016 study analyzed films by American director John Ford, Italian director Sergio Leone, Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, and Egyptian director Yusuf Shaheen, and found significantly more left-to-right movement in American, Italian, and Japanese films, but not for the Egyptian films. And a study of photographs found the same left-to-right bias in Spanish photography, but the opposite right-to-left bias in Iranian photography. What does any of this have to do with writing? Well, English, Spanish, Italian, and Japanese, cultures that show a left-to-right bias in film, have writing systems that read from left to right. And Egyptian, Arabic, and Farsi, which show a right-to-left bias in film, are written from right to left. Writing systems for human languages, unlike Heptapod, are linear. The direction of that linear string seems to introduce a directional bias that seeps into the way we think and feel about movement and position, at least on film. But it also influences how we conceive of time. When you were young, you probably learned to organize numbers on a number line. This is a skill we learn via writing, but once it's learned, it can become the default way that we organize numbers and time in our heads. What's intriguing is that the direction of our mental timeline is again anchored to the linear direction of the writing system we use. Learning to read in a left-to-right language like English, Dutch, or French causes us to mentally organize temporal sequences from left to right, while readers of right-to-left languages like Arabic will organize them from right to left. This effect of linear organization is malleable, just like the power of metaphor. You can retrain your mind to change the default linear ordering of time with a simple hack. By reading in the mirror. Forcing yourself to read text in the mirror can actually interfere with your ability to order temporal events. A 2014 study had Dutch speakers read mirrored text, which caused them to start ordering temporal events from right to left, just like Arabic speakers do. But what if you've never been exposed to a linear writing system at all? How would you spatially order temporal events? From left to right or right to left? We can answer this question by traveling to the lowlands of northern Bolivia. The Chimane people generally have very little formal education, low levels of literacy, and limited access to modern technology. In a sense, they're free from almost every possible source of bias that might impact how we organize our mental timeline. If we ask Chimane speakers to organize temporal sequences like pictures of a ripening banana or sequences of increasing size or quantity into straight lines, they show no systematic preferences at all. Some Chimane speakers will arrange things from left to right, some will choose right to left. This lack of directional preference even extends to the individual. Many Chimane speakers switch back and forth between the two directions, seemingly at random. In the absence of writing, there doesn't appear to be any particular linear organization to our conception of time. Our mental timeline in its natural state is very flexible, with no default spatial direction, but it settles into a particular direction once we learn how to read. While the non-linear heptapod language unlocks new abilities, allowing Louise to see time in a new way, the linear structure of human writing and the spatial metaphors we use to talk about time seem to almost impose a kind of limitation on our mental organization of time. Language and writing give us a spatial scaffolding that creates a linear conception of time, but also homogenizes our mental experience.
You approach language like a mathematician. You know that, right?
I will take that as a compliment.
Yeah, well, it is.
The job of a linguist is to analyze language, the same way a physicist analyzes objects in motion or a chemist analyzes chemical reactions. Language can tell us a lot about the mind and the way it works. Comparisons across languages show a common structure that linguists believe is innate to all human beings. And yet, small differences in the way languages and writing systems encode information may have an effect on the way we organize our thoughts and represent aspects of the world, including how we conceptualize time. It's serendipitous that Arrival raises the question about the power of language over our perception of time, because it was this observation about the Hopi sense of time that originally led Benjamin Whorf to his theory of linguistic relativity. The presence or absence of time reference in a language doesn't seem to have much, if any, impact on our perception of time or our behavior, but the metaphors we use to express temporal information do seem to have a subtle effect on how we mentally organize time using spatial arrangement. And writing has a big impact on the direction of our mental timeline. In Arrival, the nonlinear structure of heptapod B fundamentally changes Louise's perception of time. In the real world, the linear structure of human writing systems seems to change our internal representation of time and temporal ordering. I don't think that learning a new language, even an exotic alien language like heptapod B, will give you the ability to see into the future. I'm not a physicist, but I'm pretty sure that's not possible. Arrival is a science fiction movie, so we have to suspend our disbelief a little bit. But embedded in the central thesis of this movie is something more plausible. The idea that learning a new language could, in a subtle way, shift the way we think by giving us new ways to organize familiar ideas. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. This movie is special to me because it's a story about a linguist, and I feel like I can count those on one hand. It's based on a short story by Ted Chiang called Story of Your Life. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Ted Chiang is an amazing writer, and it's worth reading even if you've already seen the movie. Jessica Kuhn read this story right when she graduated high school, and it might have inspired her to become a linguist. Arrival actually came out when I was working on my linguistics PhD, and pretty much the whole linguistics department went together to go see the movie on opening day. It was very fun. We had a great time. A couple years later, I actually got to meet Jessica Kuhn because she was on my friend's PhD committee. She showed up for his dissertation defense via Zoom, and we just asked her a whole bunch of questions about Arrival because the movie had just come out. And she was really cool about it. By the way, if you're interested in any of the research you hear about in my videos, email the researchers. They're almost always happy to talk to people about their research, so reach out. You might be surprised at what they have to say. If you would like me to talk more about the cognitive science of movies, let me know. I love movies. I actually run Cog-Sci movie nights on campus at my university, so I would love to do more of these. And I am currently working on some more videos about language, thought, and the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So if you're interested in this topic, there is more on the way. Stick around. Love Ted Chiang.